World History, Chapter 7, Section 3, the Medieval Church. How did the church play a vital role in medieval life? These are the things that you should be able to do by the end of the section and for the chapter test. Explain how the church shaped medieval life, monastic life, and the influence that monks and nuns had on this period in history. How did the power of the church grow, and how did reformers work to change the church? And then what was the situation for the Jewish population in medieval Europe? So when we look at the church, one of the things is this is an era of lots of things. It's also known as the age of faith. The church has become a very powerful force in Europe, economically, politically, and socially. And the reason for that is we'll talk a little bit about the structure. We've talked about the structure. It's really designed to be able to be these islands of civilization in an era of kind of chaos. And so that's one of the things. Another thing is pilgrimages. You see people all over Europe that are going to these holy places to view all kinds of things. So, for example, there may be a church that claims to have a piece of the cross that Jesus was crucified upon. And you have deeply religious people who are going to view those things. And what this map shows is some of those centers for pilgrimages and then these paths that people take to go to those places. When we look at the role of the parish priest, you've got the popes, you've got the bishops, you have the archbishops and all that type of thing, but really the one person that the average everyday person has a connection to in the church is the parish priest. Their chief goal is, or their chief job is to provide the sacraments. And the sacraments are what's going to give you or grant you salvation. And this is a big deal. And part of it is if you think about, some of the descriptions of what this period is like, especially life on the manor, and you've got these outside ways of attack, this idea that hell is going to be worse than life on earth is a very frightening thought, because for the average everyday person, life here on earth during this period is very rough and tough, and they can't even begin to imagine that there's someplace worse. So they sure as heck want to do whatever they can to reach salvation and to go to heaven. The other thing about the parish priest is they are probably one of the few, if only, people that can read. The Bible is written in Latin, and so that makes the Bible kind of out of reach for the vast majority of people. And so in order to get that connection to the Word, they need to have priests who can be able to read that and give that to them. The importance of this village church. It is a place of worship. However, almost every major event in a person's life is going to take place there. So this is a social center. This is where people meet and greet. The Christian calendar is going to have all kinds of saints and feast days that people are celebrating. And so from baptism to burial, everything revolves around the church. Also, you start to see these pride that takes place in church buildings. A little bit later on, we'll talk about Gothic versus Romanesque. But what you start to see is you start to see people playing with new styles of architecture to build churches that are higher and taller and brighter. And again, the idea is to reach the heavens and to bring in the light of God. A lot of these want to have these holy relics. So in this case, the Aachen Cathedral in Germany claims to have the belt that Christ wore. And so they want to get these relics to bring people in. The other thing is people have to tithe. They're supposed to give 10% of their wealth to the church. And so that's all the things that are going on. When we look at the church dominating medieval life, in order to get to heaven, you have to follow the teachings of the church, which is the doctrine. When you look at the doctrine, the actual teachings, they claim to have men and women equal, but when we really look at how this goes into practice, it doesn't really pan out that way. And because of the teachings of the church, women are seen as those things that are listed there. And therefore, they're kind of regulated to fewer and lesser roles. And there's all kinds of double standards when it comes to the roles of men and women and the rights of men and women. And the church is going to play a role in kind of cementing those things into existence. Monasteries, this is another way that people are going to move into the church, and the church is going to have an important role. When we look at the Benedictine rule, here's really what it boils down to, is that they're going to take 3 vows of obedience, poverty, purity, and chastity, and they're going to try and fix things if at all possible. The day is spent doing those things. They worship, they work, they study, they worship, and that's pretty much their day in and day out existence. The other thing that these monasteries and churches and convents are going to provide are really, once you get to the fall of the Roman Empire, like I said, these are these islands of stability and civilization amongst all of this craziness that's going on. So the church takes over a lot of jobs that typically are probably considered to be the jobs of governments maybe. But they're going to take care of the sick. They're going to teach people how to read and write. They're going to keep track of books. They're going to create libraries. And those things are going to be preserved for future generations. So it's really the church that takes a lot of these Greek and Latin and Roman books and recopies them and saves them for later groups of people. When we look at opportunities for women, by tradition they weren't allowed to be priests, but they were allowed to be nuns and enter the religious life that way, and also go on to learn to read and write and get an education that way. When we look at the church power growing, again, I've already kind of emphasized this, the fact that it has this strict hierarchy and structure is really what enabled it to kind of survive the fall of the Roman Empire. And because of that, it is going to become a very powerful force here on earth. And so it's going to begin to turn away a little bit from maybe its religious roles and move into the earthly realm. And it's going to become part of this feudalistic system. The other thing, too, is because the church has some highly educated people, they are brought in to serve in government positions because they are probably the most educated and well-read in a lot of these places. The real kind of power for the church is that they are the ones who are the gatekeepers to salvation. And so they're able to use those things to get average everyday people, but also rulers, to do the things that they want them to do. And probably the most powerful thing they have is they have control of the sacraments. And when things are going to conflict, when the Pope is going to get into a conflict with an earthly leader, the 2 most powerful weapons are excommunication, kicking them out of the church, or interdiction, where they can put a ban on all religious services in a king's lands. And what the popes are able to do is they're able to use those threats to force kings and lords to essentially back down and do what popes want to do. Even when you look at, for example, in the instance of war, they were able to say, in order to prepare for the Sabbath, there's no fighting on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday because you need to keep holy the Lord's Day. And for the most part, kings and leaders and rulers would respect that. They'd only kill each other from Monday through Thursday, but then they'd have to take a break for church on Friday through Sunday. So that's how much power the church had. The issue becomes this, is that power and success is going to lead to all kinds of problems. You're going to see this discipline in the clergy weakening. You're going to see popes and bishops and priests who are going to focus on worldly possessions. Throughout Europe, you start to see priests getting married, so they're no longer dedicated solely to the church. They have split dualities or loyalties, and so those things are really causing problems. As these things grow, you're going to see people push for changes. And so this monastery of Cluny is this isolated monastery where they're going to focus on returning to Benedictine rules, obedience, purity, chastity, poverty, and they're going to remove themselves from these earthly concerns. And Pope Gregory is going to become this big reforming pope where he's going to try and really cut ties between the church and the earthly world. And one of those things is ending lay investiture. Lay investiture is the ability for kings and queens to appoint religious people to positions within the church. And Pope Gregory says that ends, no more. He bans the practice of priests getting married. He also is going to end this practice of buying and selling church positions, which is simony. The other thing that's going to help the church kind of grow and try and deal with reform and corruption is you get new religious orders who are going to focus on going back to the old way of doing things. And so these new orders are able to kind of cut the ties to the old world because they were outside of that old world and they're just beginning. You got these Franciscans that are these traveling preachers who are going to go out into maybe these areas that aren't being serviced and provide church services and do conversions and all kinds of things like that. And Dominicans are going to go into the world of really teaching, and they're going to become a teaching order, and they're going to hold true to the doctrines and the beliefs and the teachings of the church, and they're going to train other people to do that. Now, one of the groups that really is going to get targeted during this period is the Jewish people. Through these diasporas, this Jewish community had been spread all throughout Europe. One of the places where they do find an awful lot of tolerance is in Spain. Things are going very well for them in Spain, and they're among the most educated groups of people in Europe, and so they're really sought after to work in the government and to be doctors. Despite that, what's going to happen is as Christianity grows and expands, there's going to be this growing prejudice against the Jewish people. Because they're a small minority, usually cut off from the bigger community, they make easy targets. And the other thing is this misunderstanding of what happened in terms of the crucifixion is going to make them be the bad guys, the villains in the story of the crucifixion. And rather than blame the Romans, they're going to blame the Jewish people. And so through this intolerance, you're going to see them driven into parts of Eastern Europe. And then that's going to factor into things a little bit down the road. When we look at the Holocaust and where a lot of those death camps were set up, they were set up in Eastern Europe because that was where this big population of Jewish people were.